piensan que es un peligro. Tanto así, que algunos creen que la película de Civil War presenta la presidencia de Donald Trump y que él no querrá dejar el poder. E incluso hará que Estados Unidos se divide y ahí empiece la guerra civil. Por otra parte, algunos hablan de la historia creada por Stephen King que se volvió película, La Zona Muerte, donde un hombre tiene poderes paranormales y puede ver el futuro. Y ve cómo un político toma el control de Estados Unidos y termina destruyendo al mundo. Y por esa razón, él decide desvivir. A ese nivel, hay mucha gente que está desquiciada en Estados Unidos, que realmente ven a Donald Trump como el anticristo, o como un peligro para la humanidad. Es por eso que muchos temen por la vida de Donald Trump. Otros hablan de una conspiración, por el hecho que Donald Trump podría venir a cambiar completamente las cosas. Y es que no tiene nada que perder. Ya es mayor, y este sería su único mandato, porque esta es su reelección. Es así que ahora lo haría todo, teniendo, como te comenté en un principio, el poder de las cámaras y el poder judicial. Y es que también comentan que Donald Trump va a perseguir a todos aquellos que no lo apoyan, entre ellos muchos artistas, los cuales tienen muchos secretos oscuros y han hecho cosas terribles, y que Donald Trump los investigaría y los haría caer. Y por eso ellos estarían también en esta conspiración para acabar con Donald Trump. De esta manera, como te das cuenta, hay gente que no quiere a Donald Trump y hay gente que sí lo quiere. Y los que sí lo quieren temen que también le puede pasar algo, pero más bien porque podría cambiar cosas y revelar secretos oscuros de gente muy poderosa. Ahora dime, ¿tú qué piensas? ¿Crees que Donald Trump termine su mandato? Déjame tu reflexión, quiero conocerle. Yo soy Marco Antonio y esto es tu Cosmópolis. Nos vemos pronto, un abrazo fuerte, bye.
Actually playing the blues for Intel because we just overclocked 9800X 3D and it got even crazier. Poking a little fun there because I'm starting to learn how to play the blues. Ain't no way out here without playing the blues. I overclocked the 9800X 3D and yeah, that was a weird feeling because you can't normally overclock an X3D CPU. So I also made a platform change. I moved from X670E Taichi to the X870E Taichi. I made that platform change because what I noticed is as I was playing with the PBO scaler and adding additional clock and stuff, the X670 board would run fine, but then anytime I went to restart the system, I would just get like a full post but no video, which was really, really odd. Yeah, so the only way I could get video to come back would be to like completely power cycle the system and then actually do a clear CMOS and then it would run fine. Reapply my PBO settings and then would run through the test just fine. And then anytime I tried to restart the system, it would just do that. So this is the kind of weirdness that I think you can probably expect moving forward. When we talk about new architecture, especially overclocking architecture, that doesn't normally overclock in the past. But when I moved to the X870E Taichi board with the identical settings, identical hardware, the RAM is the same, CPU is obviously the same cooler, everything's on the test bench behind me, it's on our the open bench table, it's solid. So I think that's really gonna be not so much an X670 versus X870 thing, more so that the X870 BIOS is probably a little more fleshed out since it is the true platform for 9000 series AMD. Moving on. Let's talk about the PBO settings that I applied. We'll punch into the computer here in a moment, show you what some of the real-time tests look like in terms of frequencies and temperatures, and then we'll show you the charts and the kind of uplift we got in games. Now, PBO is kind of limited. It stands for Precision Boost Overdrive, and it's actually what AMD's auto utility kind of is, which sort of allows the boost tables to push themselves a little bit farther. Don't confuse it with a manual overclock, which is a lot more labor intensive, and it's not something I've done yet. In fact, I know Steve's going to be doing the XOC type of thing with bearded hardware, which is an XOCer. And I'm interested to see what they do for the manual overclocks, because I know they'll probably get close to 6 gigahertz on this one, to be honest. But here were the overclocks that I did. So you go into the BIOS and you do Precision Boost Overdrive, you accept the little EULA that says, hey, you could damage your CPU, et cetera, et cetera. And then you set it to motherboard limits, not auto or any of that, just motherboard limits. Then I went in and added a 200 megahertz offset, which means add 200 megahertz where possible. So we should go from a 5.2 to a 5.4 if there's no sort of power limits or anything like that enabled. Now when you enable PBO, your PPT goes from 162 watts to 1000 watts. So essentially you're getting a fully unlocked type of power delivery. but there are still other facets that are going to be limiting your overclock or the frequencies that are not necessarily visible to you. There's all sorts of other voltages and other power limits that are in place that are not necessarily going to be like on the surface for you to see. So if you go, why am I not going to 5.4 gigahertz in all core? Well, it's because the workload determines the type of boost turbo frequencies you're going to get. That's where manual overclock would come in, and I only started scratching the surface on that with X3D. Anyway, moving on, I moved the scaler up to a 10x as well. AMD recommends anywhere between 7 to 10. I was able to go 10 on this CPU, no problem whatsoever. I have a minus 15 going in the curve optimizer, and plus 200 megahertz, which I already mentioned. So those are the only settings I changed. Didn't touch voltage or any of that sort of stuff, with the exception of the curve optimizer, which is basically minusing 15 millivolts across the board, which can help with temperatures and stuff. Fun fact, it really didn't make any difference when it comes to temperatures or power draw for me because of the fact that it didn't need the extra power. So if I wanted to go in there and do even further curve optimization, I could probably go down to like a minus 30 and then see even better temperatures. But it really wasn't showing me any, like it really wasn't running any hotter because we're only pushing it up to a maximum of 200 megahertz higher, which is not pushing voltages or any of that. So with that said, let's just get right into the benchmarks. Let's talk about the type of uplift we saw, and then we'll do some live demonstration. All right, so the biggest thing that we're gonna be comparing here too is obviously itself in stock speed, but all the other CPUs are on the chart too. So gonna go through it kind of fast, so pause on the ones you wanna see. But now Cinebench R24 one thread, it's actually a pretty big jump to go from 133 to 139. That's a significant improvement, to be honest, from a 1346 to a 1383 in multi-core. Now, the clock speeds are only up to 200 megahertz faster. That's gonna be asking a lot to try and overcome the core deficits. That's why in productivity it is not the strongest looking CPU on the chart. But R23, we did go from a 2085 to a 2182 single core. That actually put it at, actually R24 put it at the fastest single core we have on our chart so far. But if we take a look at R23, went from a 22986 to a 23697, not a very big percentage improvement. Again, only the frequency differences here. 2085 to a 2182. Blender, same sort of story. Monster uplift from a 14613 to a 15415. Junk Shop 10373 to 10792. And then 7236 to 7503 in Classroom. Handbrake only dropped 2 seconds from an 82-second in transcode from 4K video down to 1080p. And then if we take a look at our Geekbench one thread, 3303 to a 3469. So a pretty decent jump right there of about 166 points. If we take a look at multi-thread, 18243 to an 18780. Again, nothing incredible to talk about. So time spy goes from a 7450 to a 7651. But when we get into games, this is where it goes to show, like, I would have thought at this point we were reaching GPU bottleneck, because we do test in 1080p because we're adding a bottleneck to our CPU. So many people just don't seem to get that when it comes to CPU testing. We hear you though. We're gonna start adding 1440p and 4K in these same charts so you can compare them all at the same time. But moving on, we went from a 384 average FPS in Shadow of the Tomb Raider with DirectX 12 up to 404, so we gained 20 FPS. Again, it's only around, what, 4 or 5%, somewhere around there, but still an uplift nonetheless for just pushing some buttons. If we look at Cyberpunk 2077, from a 278 average up to a 294, and our minimum came up as well from a 218 to a 229. Looking at Borderlands 3, we go from a 436 up to a 459. And then if we take a look at F1, this is where we saw the biggest improvement actually. We went from a 544 to a 583. We gained nearly 40 FPS. But more importantly, our minimum came up from 459 to 503. It puts our minimum in F1 as faster than every other CPU other than itself. So the fastest CPU average was 492, which was the 285K with the overclock of the cache and the E-cores and the 8400 megahertz CU DIMMs. Don't forget, our 9800 X3D is running at 6,000 megatransfers. It has a 2400 megatransfer disadvantage versus the Intel running at 8400 on the CU DIMMs. And it's still being beaten by the minimum FPS of the 9800 X3D in F1. That's pretty bonkers. Horizon Zero Dawn, we go from a 306 to a 323. So not a huge jump, but a jump nonetheless. So for pushing some buttons and moving some knobs in the BIOS, that's actually pretty insane to get that kind of uplift for only, what we were getting was a, what, 3.8% or so overclock? But we were getting more than that in many of these benchmarks in terms of uplift in game percentage. Typically, if you get a 5% overclock of like a GPU, you can get 5% over like extra frames. It kind of works linear like that. But on the CPU, it can actually be exponential, where depending on how much of the bottleneck you're being hit, the overclock can actually give you bigger than that percentage uplift when it comes to games, depending again how hard the GPU is being bottlenecked. So again, the 4090 at 1080p medium, even in the 500 FPS range in a game like F1, is still CPU bound, which is crazy to think about. Moving on, let's talk about the other discussion here is whether or not AMD is going to honor a warranty, though, for enabling PBO. The biggest discussion regarding PBO is the fact that they technically void the warranty. If they don't have an eFuse in there, there's no way for them to know. But that's another question I should probably have with them directly on how do you know if PBO has been enabled, and why are you telling testers to enable it and try it out and talk about it if it's going to void warranties? That's a little shady. So anyway, moving on. Here is hardware monitor. You can see right now we're idling just with Cinebench open in the mid 2000s to low 3000s. Here's our core clocks right there. Multi-core though, you'll see we'll hit 5.4 for like a second. So it's 5.4, 5.395, and then it drops down to 5.23, 5.295. So we're getting just under 5.3. But if I do single core, we'll be able to see that single core push up higher. So there it is, 5.425 right there. So that's our 200 above our 5225, which is our max frequency before. So you can see we're getting the full 200 megahertz right there. So that's where we're seeing the biggest uplift when it comes to games, is the fact that most games are not pushing all the cores at the same time, which means the less amount of cores you have being pushed to the limit means the higher the frequency can actually go. In this instance, 5.425 is the maximum we're allowed to go, unless you do manual overclocking, which again, I've already said I haven't done in this video because I just wanted to see what some PBO scaling can do out of the box on an X3D CPU. And this is all new to us because we've never seen X3D CPUs come anywhere close to the frequencies of their non-X3D brethren, although this is still at a frequency deficit versus like the 9950X, 9900X and all of that, because of the fact that, again, reasons. It'll be nice to see a 6 gigahertz X3D CPU. Could you imagine that? That's going to be crazy to see when the overclockers reach that type of number and higher. But let's do this now. Let me go ahead and load up Cyberpunk here. I'll get it going in a window so we can see everything happening with the CPU. But I do like Cyberpunk because of the fact that it allows us to have a title that pushes both CPU and GPU together because of how much happening in the world threads. But as you can see, because we are not in a highly stressful work thread or workload, we're just at 5.425 on all the cores. But look at our temperatures right here. We're at 61.1, 61.0 in games right now. Like, that's crazy. That's one of the reasons why the clocks can stay up so high, because the core is no longer being suffocated and smothered with basically a weighted blanket on top of it, like the 7800 X3D and the other 7000 series CPUs are. So you can see right here with the CPU package power, including IO die, we're at 112, 113. So again, far below the 162 we're expecting to be able to see. One of the biggest complaints people had about 7000 series when it first came out was it ran hot. At least it looked like it ran hot because it wanted to go up to 95C no matter what. But we're hitting the frequency limits long before we're hitting the temperature limits, just like X3D 7000 series was doing, but those limits are higher now. So I'd love to see this maybe make it to like 5.6, 5.7 gigahertz all core in the future as it gets a little more mature when it comes to this stacked process. If you consider the fact that all we did was move some sliders around, yes, I know it's 1080p. If we were to put it at a higher resolution, we might even see the temperatures come down on the CPU a little bit. In fact, let's do that real quick. Let's go ahead and go 4K, sure. So we've already come down from what, 61 down to the mid 50s? Yeah, because we're not hitting it now with that hard bottleneck. So it's not having to work as hard. Let's just hope that they can keep the price around the $480 it's intended to be, because it's not a $600 CPU. It's not worth that. Let's just, if it can stick around to the $480 to $500 price point, which is a lot for a CPU still these days, and it forces the 7800 X3D CPU to drop in price, that makes it still a really good CPU to consider getting if you don't care about overclocking or any of that stuff. It's still a GOAT. It's just, it's the GOAT. It was the greatest of all time. Was the greatest of all time, but still good. So it's the GOAT, whatever. All right, there you go. That's just a quick overclock to see what would happen. It's gonna take some time to really figure out the nuances of overclocking this thing, because I'm wondering if we can overclock some of the fabric. How's that gonna affect this? Something we couldn't really do before. At least with X3D, it's just been complicated. All right, guys, I need to get faster RAM in this. I think we need to start pushing like 7,200 and above maybe with this, because X870 is supposed to allow us to go up to near 8,000 megahertz, which would probably lift even more of the CPU performance, especially in games. All right, guys, thanks for watching. As always, we'll see you in the next one. Good boy.
I literally only got this because of how cool it looks. I don't really like Powkitty devices, but this one stood out to me. Its exposed little bottom part, the retro beige color, the giant D-pad, the 4x3 screen, the Game Boy size. I just had to check it out for myself. I have a bunch of Anbernic devices. They're basically a competitor to Powkitty. Both of these companies release a bunch of handhelds that all use the same chip. There might be some cosmetic differences or maybe an extra button here or there, but for the most part, a lot of their devices all use the same chip. For Anbernic, it's the H700. For Powkitty, it's the RK3566. This here is the RGB20 Pro, which is essentially the same device as the RGB30 with the same RK3566 chip. Which is a little disappointing because it doesn't make it very unique. But I do really like the RGB30, and I never made a dedicated video on it, so I figured it was worth talking about a similar product. What I like about the RGB30 is that it's cheap, it's got decent emulation quality, and it's got a unique 1x1 screen. At least, it was unique at the time. This screen is super cool for Game Boy games and arcade games. Well, the RGB20 Pro is a bit cooler looking, with a lot of the same specs, but a 4x3 screen. So we're losing a little bit of its charm, but it gains a little bit more charm in the looks department. Even though it's virtually the same hardware, it does lose a little bit of emulation quality due to some drama behind the stock operating system it comes with. It's been interesting finally getting to look at a Powkitty device after all these years. I think the last Powkitty device that I made a dedicated video on was so bad that I titled the video something along the lines of "Emulation is terrible right now," because there were just a lot of really bad devices at the time. That same year, companies like Anbernic and MiU released some of my favorite retro handhelds, so it turned around very quickly, and hopefully Powkitty took some notes and made some adjustments to the stuff that they were making. This device is definitely a comfortable device. I love the big massive D-pad and its placement on here. Straight from the manufacturer, the RGB20 Pro can play NES all the way up to N64 and even Nintendo DS games. Although I would hesitate to recommend it for anything above Game Boy Advance. It has some pretty solid emulation when it comes to 2D stuff, but once we get into 3D territory, I'm personally a little bit disappointed. In the past year, we've had better emulation quality from similar devices in the same price point. Which is weird, because I remember the RGB30 being just fine when I got it, and it's virtually the same hardware, so what gives? Well, the RGB30 came with the Gelos operating system, which was originally designed as a custom firmware. Now, I don't want to start any rumors or point any fingers or anything, but I remember hearing at one point that Gelos wasn't very happy with these companies releasing their free custom firmware on their devices that they were selling. So Gelos has since disbanded and then came back together under the Rocknix name. So this RGB20 Pro, which has the exact same internals as the RGB30, runs on Arc OS. It's very similar. I tried to look up what happened with Gelos and Powkitty, and also it launched on some Anbernic devices. I remember there being some sort of drama, but of course I can't find any proof of that right now, so just consider it a conspiracy theory for the moment. The launcher that ArcOS has is just a typical emulation station style launcher, which I don't hate. It makes me less compelled to put custom firmware on here, I don't love how N64 plays stock. It's a little bit slow. It also has some weird texture issues. I've seen this happen before with handhelds like this, and the fix is usually using a different emulation core. However, none of the emulation cores that came on here did N64 any better. So I would struggle to recommend this for N64 emulation specifically. I also noticed the thumbstick sensitivity is kind of for N64 games. It doesn't have the same cardinal direction snapping issues that the Android devices have with stock firmware. The issue here is that there isn't a lot of walk-in room. You're either not moving or full sending it at all times. You can walk, it's just harder to do on here. Game Boy Advance runs great, and so does Game Boy, and it does look pretty great on this device. But by default, they take up the whole 4:3 screen. It looks especially bad for Game Boy games, which are usually a 10:9 aspect ratio. Under RetroArch settings, video scaling aspect ratio, you can select 10:9. But then after that, you have to go all the way back to the root menu and save the configuration file. Now, every time you load a Game Boy game, it will look the way it was intended. Changing the setting also weirdly changed Game Boy Advance games to render at 3:2. I guess they use the same emulation core? Now, this screen's pixel layout doesn't really allow for pixel-perfect integer scaling. The resolution is 1024 by 768, which is a very strange resolution. However, that is a pretty heavily pixel-dense resolution. Even though the math doesn't add up perfectly when you scale a small Game Boy screen up to the full resolution of this screen, it looks just fine to me. I didn't notice any differences really at all when playing Game Boy or Game Boy Advance games without integer scaling turned on. You would expect to see some aliasing on here, but I didn't. So I'm happy to have my games scaled to fit the whole screen on here. If you're a fan of shaders and filters, you might not like the ones that come stock on here, and some of those will have a problem without integer scaling. They do look a bit worse. SNES passes the Yoshi's Island test, but I won't be showing that on here because it gives Nintendo too much power over me, and I don't like that. Mega Man X shows the horrors of non-integer scaling. The health bar isn't uniform. Oh, the humanity. Integer scaling does fix this, but it does make the screen just a little bit smaller. There is also a sharp shimmerless shader preset. Say that 3 times fast. This allows the game to take up the full screen and also smooths out any scaling issues. This might be the best compromise, and it's an option that comes stock on the system. This does have the capability to run DS games, and to my surprise, they played pretty decent on here. A lot of DS games don't need you to be looking at 2 screens at the same time. Tapping a button to swap between screens works just fine for a lot of the DS library, but not Sonic Rush. That's rough.
Okay, I understand. This is so confusing. Oh, this is not a good game for a single screen.
There isn't really a lot of slowdown on here for DS emulation. I'm surprised by how well DS runs. This also has the capability of PSP games, but I wouldn't put any stock into that. So overall, it's a decent device, but it does lose out on size and performance, especially if you're comparing it to everything else that's out there already. It's somewhere between the size of a Game Boy Color and a DMG Game Boy, but it's definitely bigger than a lot of devices within the price point. The price is fine, it's around $70, but for the same price, there are devices that perform a little better. And a lot of those devices are more pocketable. You'd be getting this strictly for the looks. On the plus side, because this chip is so widely used, there is already custom firmware for this. I mentioned before that Rocknix is available for this, and it was extremely easy to put on here. Just download it from their GitHub, run the ISO through Balena Etcher to put it on a fresh micro SD card. My issue was getting games on here. Moving them over to the SD card did not work for me. I had to use a second fresh micro SD card to put my ROM library on here.
Nah, it's honestly not much better. It's still got slowdown. Oof, that was rough. I will give it credit though, the textures aren't freaking out, so it's got that going for it at least. At least Game Boy's the right aspect ratio. I might have taken my settings though. Basically, what you're getting here is the same OS. It's just got a different look to its launcher. That's really it. But Rocknix has Portmaster. I made a video on Portmaster a little bit ago. It's great on the Anbernic devices, and it's pretty much the same here. This is running maybe a little slower than it does on the Anbernic, but it's cool that you even have the ability to port PC games on here. You should watch my whole video if you want more information on it. But it's really easy to put some of your low-powered PC games on here, and some games that are already ready to go. This device has Wi-Fi. I had it connected to my 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi band, but everything's fine. Portmaster allows you to just download some of its open source games that it has. This is just a random one that I downloaded called Overgun, but there is a pretty decently big library. Again, just watch my video on Portmaster if you want more information on it.
So you can get a little more functionality with the custom firmware. You could also take the stock or the custom firmware and tweak it to be pretty decent. But there's just so many devices that work so great just right out of the box. There's so much competition now. It is nice to see something that's at least unique looking. The design is what drew me to it. It's what I like the most about it. It will definitely turn a few heads. It stands out. And you know what? It can play a lot of your game library just fine. But if you want the most bang for your buck, and you want the most functionality, there are other options. Even if you want something that's more portable, Powkitty themselves have better options. You're literally just getting this for that cool chip window, and you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. I should mention that people pointed me towards Retro Breeze, who is working on a slimmer back piece for this, and I do intend on doing that to mine. Printed with this brand new bad boy that I got right here. I hit it way too hard. I like the way this thing is now, but imagine how cool it would be if it was super thin. That might change it a little bit for me. Anyway, what do you guys think about the Powkitty RGB20 Pro? Or Powkitty devices in general. I never really talk about them on here because I don't think a lot of them are that exciting. This one seemed exciting because it looked cool, and that's about it. Leave it in the comments below. Add me on Twitter, any and all of this other social media garbage. A lot of this stuff was streamed over on twitch.tv/wolfden, where the chat helped me out with this. It is helpful to publicly mess around with this stuff so that I can get ahead of some comments when they inevitably tell me I did something wrong. Thank you, Trade, for sponsoring this video. I've been drinking your coffee a lot. And of course, the most important thing you can do to help support this channel is just subscribe right here. We need more people to hit that button and that bell and share this video with a friend. A friend who might be interested in seeing the little chip on the inside of their handheld while they're playing it. Thank you very much. See you later.
Pues bienvenido, diputado Jorge Espadas, coordinador de los diputados del PAN en el Congreso local. Pues a sus órdenes.
Pues igualmente aquí estamos con el gusto de saludarlos y a la orden. ¿Qué hay que hacer? Platícame.
Pues recientemente presentaron su agenda legislativa, que nos pueda profundizar más sobre este tema.
Es correcto, fíjate que nosotros estamos presentando una agenda que tiene una base, que es lo que le propusimos a las personas en campaña, que tiene que ver con la oferta que registramos inclusive entre la autoridad electoral, ante el Instituto Electoral del Estado de Guanajuato, donde dijimos que íbamos a trabajar, ¿no? Cuáles son los rubros que ofertamos en campaña. ¿Y de qué hablamos? Hablamos de seguridad, de desarrollo de las familias, del fortalecimiento de las familias, hablamos de el tema del desarrollo económico, empleos, hablamos de salud y hablamos de muchos temas, y ahorita estamos concretando ya la agenda una vez que arrancamos con varios temas. Un tema que ha sido un reclamo recurrente o una necesidad recurrente que se va modificando en todo el estado y en todo el país y en todo el mundo son los residuos sólidos, la basura que generamos como personas, como industrias, como familias. Bueno, es un tratamiento que se está proponiendo a través de una nueva ley que ya fue presentada hace unos días. Sí. Otro tema, ustedes lo vieron hace una semana, el tema de la regulación de un padrón de motocicletas.
Correcto.
Para saber quién vende las motocicletas, qué concesionaria, qué agencia y a quién se las están vendiendo. Esto aquí ayuda a tener una base de información que le permita a la autoridad investigadora de los delitos, al Ministerio Público, el saber quién vendió esa motocicleta y a quién como un punto de partida de las investigaciones en dos rubros: cuando se comete un delito a bordo de una motocicleta o, por ejemplo, a muchos trabajadores hoy en León, en Guanajuato, que les roban su moto que es como su mecanismo de traslado para su trabajo, ¿no? Este es otro tema que estamos ya presentando. Hablamos también de un impuesto que busque gravar las ganancias que tienen en los casinos, por ejemplo, las personas, como un mecanismo para tratar de inhibir un poco el tema de la ludopatía. Hablamos de temas importantes como generar en el transporte público un espacio seguro para las mujeres, los espacios en los autobuses que son exclusivos para las mujeres, estos en los municipios donde se presta el transporte público en ruta fija, entre otros temas que estamos trabajando en la agenda legislativa.
Del tema de los residuos, diputado, hemos visto pues que hay en varios municipios no hay un trato adecuado de estos residuos, incluso en la propia capital donde hubo un incendio hace poco más de un año, y entre otros, ¿no? Por ahí de 22, 24 municipios que tienen su basurero a cielo abierto. ¿Qué va a hacer o qué vislumbran ustedes hacer en este tema?
2 puntos tenemos que trabajar.
Ajá.
El manejo de los residuos, que lo estamos abordando a través de la reforma que se planteó en el Congreso, que la presentó la diputada Marisa a nombre de las diputadas y diputados del PAN y del PRD. Sí. Y otro tema que tenemos que estudiar es a raíz del proyecto de presupuesto que presenta el día 25 la gobernadora Livia Denis, donde se ha manifestado esta preocupación y tenemos que trabajar mucho en los rellenos sanitarios. Tenemos un tema de ubicar rellenos seguramente regionales. Tenemos el problema que bien señalas en Guanajuato.
Hola amigos y amigas, ¿cómo están? Soy Nacho 10 en otra edición más de El Ganso Informativo. Mauricio todavía no ha llegado, pero bueno, arrancamos porque tenemos un montón de información y vamos a arrancar con una noticia, un desafuero. El día de hoy a arrancar el desafuero de Alito al instalarse una comisión clave, precisamente donde ya dictan las reglas y lo que viene. Es muy interesante, hoy la Alito también respondió, está temblando. Vamos a hablar también del superpeso, y es que hoy, después de la llamada que tuvo Claudia Sheinbaum con Donald Trump, rebota el superpeso y ya regresa a los 19 pesos. Denunciarán penalmente a Lili Telles y Marco Cortés por traidores a la patria. Incluso Claudia Sheinbaum sacó esto, lo dijo en la mañanera, piñalista, plan B, su propio plan B para tumbar la reforma judicial. No se han frenado, continúa todo esto. Mientras cae la jueza de Veracruz, Nancy Juárez, esta que pretendía encerrar a Claudia Sheinbaum por no tumbar la reforma judicial. Reaparece Marcelo Ebrard después de la polémica de su viaje de Japón y bueno, regresa en medio del triunfo de Donald Trump. Se vuelve viral el tema, una psiquiatra que es abogada en realidad, pero que la verdad es que estuvo mintiendo a medio mundo. Bueno, hoy ha sido destapada. La verdad es que eso es un tema que está muy fuerte en México. También se hace muy viral un video de Carlos Bonavides hablando sobre el Banco del Bienestar y sobre apoyo a adultos mayores, muy interesante. Sale una nueva encuesta de Claudia Sheinbaum a nivel internacional. Y es la primera vez que lo comparan con otros líderes mundiales. Vamos a ver en qué lugar acabó. Por cierto, Marco Cortés sale a responder a Claudia Sheinbaum después de que lo acusó de traidor a la patria y ridículo. Y hace unos minutos México perdió una demanda del TEMEC en tema del maíz transgénico. Esto va a impactar también muy fuerte. Bueno, este más el día de hoy en el Ganso Informativo. Así que si no lo han hecho, les ruego que se suscriban, denle like, comenten y compartan para que lleguemos a más auditorio. Y vamos a arrancar con una llamada telefónica. El día de hoy, como lo había comentado Claudia Sheinbaum en la mañanera, tuvo una llamada telefónica, su primera, con Donald Trump. Y bueno, así lo subió Claudia Sheinbaum en su tweet. Tuvimos una llamada muy cordial con el presidente electo Donald Trump, en la que hablamos de la buena relación que había, o que habrá más bien, entre México y Estados Unidos. Entonces, bueno, pues es un reconocimiento interesante, ¿no? Y bueno, porque también ayer muchos se quedaron con lo que había dicho Claudia Sheinbaum de que no se quería apresurar para felicitar a Trump, que iba a esperar pues a que se acabara el conteo, que Kamala Harris considera la derrota. Y bueno, pues estaban así, ya se está revelando. Pero no, va tranquilo. ¿Y qué pasa? Bueno, lo podemos ver en el peso. El día de hoy, después al momento de hacer este video, 19.88 pesos por dólar. Wow, la verdad es que de 20. 80 que estaba en 20.80 en el peor momento, ahora está en 19.88. Y eso es súper interesante, o sea, el peso se ha apreciado en 2 días un peso completo, ¿no? De 20.80 a 19.88. Un peso completo en 48 horas. Es lo que ha ganado el superpeso. Está rebotando muy fuerte, revelando que, bueno, la verdad es que los inversionistas ven con buenos ánimos la relación, o sea que Donald Trump, por ejemplo, tiene esto de que va a deportar masivamente, pero la verdad es que eso importa poco al peso, importa poco a la cuestión de comercio, ¿no? La vez pasada, en el 2016, lo que estaba en juego era precisamente en ese momento el TLC, era la disputa y no sabían que obviamente sin el TLC eso se iba a generar una gran problema de comercio, pero ahorita no, ahorita existe el TMEC y esto al final lo garantiza que va a seguir el comercio. Y Ebrard, por ejemplo, ya que por fin reaparece de Japón, o no sé si está enfermo, no lo tengo muy claro, pero reaparece públicamente, habla sobre este tema, y es importante, interesante, dice que antes estaba más difícil la cosa en 2016, hace 6 años, 2018, ahorita no tanto, porque está el TMEC, y eso es interesante, vamos a escuchar a Ebrard.
Economía muy vigorosa y de una gran oportunidad para nuestro país. Esa es la base de la relación con el nuevo gobierno que va a encabezar el presidente Trump. Es decir, esto que les acabo de referir es fruto de un tratado que se negoció entre México y él y ha sido el mejor negocio que hemos hecho los dos países. Entonces lo que tenemos que hacer ahora es trabajar para fortalecer eso. Yo sé que hay aprensiones, preocupaciones, pero el dato objetivo es ese. Hace 6 años estaba más difícil, porque era una idea. Hoy es una realidad, es un gran éxito ese tratado. 6.5% de crecimiento en un año, ¿se imagina? Que puede México lograr los 6 años que vienen. Entonces, estos datos los publicó la Oficina del Censo de los Estados Unidos, no son datos de nosotros. Coinciden con los nuestros, pero el origen. Entonces, yo estoy optimista, no digo que vaya a ser fácil, porque no es fácil, pero la relación con el presidente Trump va a ser muy buena, con su gobierno también. ¿Y qué es lo que nos une? Pues lo que nos une son estos números. Es una economía gigantesca. ¿Eso qué quiere decir? Pues millones de empleos de Estados Unidos. Quiere decir recursos impresionantes, estamos hablando entre las exportaciones e importaciones de cifras muy, muy importantes. Y quiere decir prosperidad. Entonces, esa va a ser nuestra base de diálogo y negociación con el presidente Trump, que además, como ya dije, pues hoy tiene que hacer esas negociaciones.
El tema de los aranceles.
Bueno, eso siempre va a estar presente, pero yo insistiría en que soy optimista porque a diferencia de otros países, pues nosotros somos el principal socio, entonces pones una avance. Nosotros importamos cosas de Estados Unidos, las integramos y luego eso se va al mercado de Estados Unidos. Si tú le pones un arancel, el consumidor allá tendría que pagar más.
Sí, al final es distinto. Ahorita, porque poner aranceles a productos mexicanos, al limón, al aguacate, lo único que va a generar es que en Estados Unidos estas cosas salen más caras. Y va a pagar el consumidor estadounidense precisamente con una alta inflación. Y no creo que Trump, después de ganar esto, provoque eso. Bueno, Mauricio Diego, ¿qué tal?
Así es, Nacho, buenas tardes a todos. Y ese es el problema, la realidad del México del 2018 cuando llega Donald Trump.
Cuando 2016.
Bueno, cuando llega el presidente Obrador.
Ajá.
Pero cuando se hace la renegociación también del TMEC, ya con pues el visto bueno incluso del nuevo gobierno, del gobierno entrante del presidente Obrador, es una realidad muy distinta a la de este 2024, Nacho. Es otro escenario completamente diferente.
Claro.
En aquel entonces China era el principal proveedor hacia los Estados Unidos y por mucho. Y ya después también de este acuerdo y de los esfuerzos del gobierno de México y el famoso nearshoring, relocalización, como le quieran decir ustedes, poco a poco esta tendencia se fue revirtiendo y México se fue convirtiendo en el principal socio. Y en el mes de septiembre, Nacho, se rompieron todos los récords. Se alcanzó un comercio, una exportación histórica hacia los Estados Unidos en septiembre. Y como lo dice el propio Marcelo, o sea, y esa es la realidad, si el día de mañana Trump quiere poner aranceles a los productos mexicanos, lo primero que va a suceder es que va a tener una inflación allá en los Estados Unidos, porque no puede reemplazar de la noche a la mañana todos los productos que exportamos hacia Estados Unidos. Eventualmente lo puedes hacer, pero no sucederá de un día para otro. Y en segundo lugar, que es lo que comentábamos creo que el día de ayer, ¿no? Que ¿de dónde van a venir los productos? Si no son de México, pues de China. Y entonces, lo que quiere hacer Trump, que es frenar el avance del bloque chino, de bloque de Asia encabezado por China, entonces Estados Unidos se va a convertir en el motor también de ese avance. O sea, le va a salir contraproducente. Entonces, yo creo que cuando Trump empiece a revisar ya cómo está la situación, cómo va a recibir el gobierno y todo este escenario binacional, trinacional con Canadá, pues las cosas no van a ser tan fáciles para él, ¿no? O sea, no va a ser tan fácil empezar a amagar con esto los impuestos. Eventualmente sí, asustar con el petate del muerto, pero México también sabe y tiene muy claro la presidenta dónde estamos parados.
Sí, no es igual. O sea, en 2016 Mauricio era Peña Nieto el presidente, entonces éramos un chiste de país, y aparte Peña Nieto ridiculizado a nivel internacional, no respetado. Y bueno, Trump en ese momento todo un león. Y bueno, con Obrador, acuérdense que Obrador le dio su lugar. Le dio su lugar siempre. Y eso también le agradó mucho a Donald Trump. Le dio su lugar bien. Incluso lo defendió Obrador cuando corren a Donald Trump del Twitter. Acuérdense que también hace 4 años esperó el presidente López Obrador un mes completo para reconocer el triunfo de Joe Biden, porque al final había todas muchas dudas sobre la elección. Ese tipo de cosas al final, incluso Trump lo refleja, lo dice, es que me cae muy bien, aunque sea un socialista, pero es un buen socialista. Bueno, y Claudia Sheinbaum también es una persona muy parecida a Obrador, entonces la verdad es que no hay ningún problema.
Además, Nacho, ya que hablaron hoy, pues ella le habló en inglés, no necesitó traductor, ya le pudo decir todas las cosas. Claro. En primera persona, ¿no? Que también eso en el trato personal cuenta, sí, como no.
Sí, claro. Bueno, en el medio de todo esto aquí en México, bueno, surge la nueva polémica de los traidores a la patria. Y bueno, Claudia Sheinbaum acabó, liquidó, pulverizó a Marco Cortés. Y literal dijo, es que no sé si decirle ridículo o traidor.
Ayer lo leí y no sé si también vieron su declaración el día de la decisión de la Corte, el día antes de ayer, en donde hacía un llamado al ejército para que tomara partido. No sé si decir que está haciendo el ridículo o de plano llamarle traidor a la patria, porque es que no hay explicación intermedia. Ellos perdieron más bien. Ellos tuvieron un porcentaje de votación en esta alianza del grupo conservador del PRI, el PAN y el extinto PRD, pues de un porcentaje muy menor al que obtuvimos nosotros, reconocido por las instituciones electorales, que eso es muy importante, por el INE y por el Tribunal Electoral del Poder Judicial de la Federación. Durante toda la campaña hablaron de que estaban a favor de los programas sociales. Después, el presidente del PAN sale a decir que se equivocaron, que son unos mentirosos, porque ellos nunca estuvieron de acuerdo con los programas sociales. Porque así reconoció, ¿no? Lo que les dijimos al pueblo de México es mentira. Nosotros nunca hemos estado a favor de los programas sociales. Después, aquí mismo en la conferencia, cuando los programas sociales se vota en la Cámara de Diputados y Senadores para que pasen a la Constitución los programas de bienestar, el PAN vota en lo general a favor y yo en la conferencia digo, bueno, ¿están a favor o están en contra? Y entonces en lo particular votan en contra.
Marco y en general de los panistas que no saben qué hacer con su vida. Pero ya salió Mauricio Marco Cortés a responderle a Claudia Sheinbaum. Dice que él no es traidor, ¿no? Bueno, vamos a escuchar a Marco.
Narcoterrorismo se han multiplicado a lo largo y ancho de todo el país. Sinaloa, Chiapas, Michoacán, Guerrero, Guanajuato, Jalisco, Veracruz, Sonora. Lamentablemente, en muchos estados más ya se han presentado escenarios de narcobloqueos, de incendios de casa, de negocios y masacres. Por eso hemos propuesto tipificar al narcoterrorismo como un delito grave. Es un delito que causa profundo dolor a las familias mexicanas. Y lo que hemos propuesto es una muy estrecha colaboración y coordinación internacional para que México pueda combatir eficazmente la delincuencia organizada. Pero el régimen morenista, fiel a su estilo, quiere confundir a la población con el falso argumento de que se trata de un intervencionismo y que se pone en riesgo la soberanía. Eso es completamente falso. Presidenta, le pido respeto a nuestras ideas, aunque usted no coincida con ellas. Ni estoy haciendo el ridículo, ni mucho menos soy traidor a la patria. Lo que le estamos haciendo es propuestas para que se establezca una estrecha y efectiva cooperación internacional ante un grave y creciente problema transnacional, particularmente con nuestros principales socios comerciales, con los que compartimos más de 3,000 kilómetros de frontera. Con su política de abrazos a los criminales, lo único que ha aumentado es la violencia.
Bueno, ahí está, ¿no? El ridículo traidor Marco Cortés con el tema del narcoterrorismo. Y bueno, es que el terrorismo, hay que recordar que claro que existe, pero tiene un ingrediente muy ideológico y hasta religioso, podríamos decirle así. Y aquí en México lo que pasa, si bien no se niega la violencia de los cárteles, es obvio y evidente, pero no es por este ingrediente religioso, ingrediente ideológico, ¿no? Es disputa por plazas, finalmente es una cuestión hasta, bueno, así comercial, nada más que en lugar de utilizar jueces, juicios, utilizan balas, pero es el pleito por el negocio, o sea que no tiene nada que ver con el terrorismo, como tradicionalmente se le entiende, a pesar de que claro, obviamente sí hay violencia. Pero sí, obviamente eso también lo quiere hacer Marco Cortés para que si son terroristas, el cártel de Sinaloa o el de Jalisco, entonces pues en Estados Unidos están obligados a bombardear porque están en su ley, está la ley patriota, la que surge después de los atentados de las Torres Gemelas, obligados finalmente a buscar. Y es por eso también, por esa razón bombardean Siria y por todo eso, porque al final dicen, que hay terroristas. Además, por esa razón Israel está moviendo Gaza, es el mismo pretexto. Estamos intentando destruir a Hamas y el otro intentando destruir a Hezbollah y con ese pretexto es suficiente para bombardear. Y es lo que quiere que Marco Cortés aquí a nuestro país, quiere que nos bombardee Estados Unidos, lo cual es verdaderamente lamentable y claro que es una traición a la patria.
Sí, es
No big deal. Just put the gun to their head and...
Eddie?
Oh, hi, James.
What happened here? Who was that?
I don't know. He just came at me.
Okay. So he attacked you, and you shot him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. He made me do it.
Okay, calm down, Eddie. Any idea why he would do that?
I don't know. He came out of nowhere. Tried sneaking up on me in the dark. I heard footsteps, so I turned back and he was right there.
And you could tell that he wanted to hurt you.
Well, yeah, I mean, the way he looked at me, I just had to do it.
He looked at you? I thought you said he came at you.
Yeah, I mean, hey, I could see it in his eyes.
His eyes?
He kept looking at me, making fun of me. And I told him not to, but he didn't listen.
Eddie, you can't just kill someone because of the way they looked at you.
You should see your face, James. I was just joking. The guy was dead when I got here. I got you, didn't I? Well, anyway, I better get going.
Wait. You're gonna go out there alone?
Yeah.